high point of Julian's invasion. From that moment on, it was pretty much all downhill. The first thing that struck the Roman officers the next morning, and the first thing that makes us think that perhaps Julian had not thought this through fully, was the impressive defensive fortifications Ctesiphon now boasted. You'll recall from past episodes that sacking Ctesiphon was practically a rite of passage for Roman emperors there for a while, and really, all they had to do was show up and the city would surrender. But the advanced fortification techniques that had begun cropping up at the end of the 3rd century were not a strictly Roman phenomenon. Even with his full army, and he was still waiting for the decoy army to rejoin his main force, it would take time and effort to dislodge the Sassanids now that they were settling in for a siege. More to the point, the Romans would probably be unable to take the city before Shapur arrived with the main Persian army. And even if Shapur took his time getting to Ctesiphon, the royal canal, the one that had been closed because of excessive flooding, well, it was now flooding and creating a malaria-ridden swamp for the Romans to camp in. So, where did that leave them? What was the plan now? Initially, Julian argued in favor of launching the siege anyway, but in the command tent, he was pummeled by a nearly unanimous officer corps that told him in no uncertain terms that, in their professional opinion, a siege would be suicide. Finally, Julian relented and agreed to call off the assault. So, okay, now that that's settled, what's the new plan? Sacking Ctesiphon would have been nice, but what was the greater purpose it would have served? It's clear we need to change our approach, so what's our overarching strategic goal? Maybe we can rejigger our methods and achieve the same result? Are we trying to conquer Persia? Are we trying to remove Shapur from power? Are we simply trying to force him to give us a better peace deal? What are we doing out here? Though we do not have a solid record of these meetings, it appears that Julian did not really have answers to these questions. Sacking Ctesiphon had likely been an end unto itself. Now that he had run into a wall, literally a big, thick wall, Julian wasn't sure what to do. He was going to have to improvise his way out of this, and the plan he came up with was pretty clearly not in the original playbook. Going back the way that they had come would have been too difficult, so the emperor decided to lead his army up the Tigris River, which was the quickest route back to Armenia and back to safety. The Roman soldiers were understandably skeptical of this plan. I mean, isn't that the direction Shapur is coming from? But they went from skeptical to appalled when they learned the next part of the plan, that Julian was also planning to burn the 1,000 supply ships. It would have been much too difficult to haul them all back upriver, and leaving them behind meant leaving them gift-wrapped for Shapur. But the cold logic of command is sometimes lost on the average grunt. All the grunt sees is that the things that bring him food are going up in smoke. So on top of having to call an audible in the middle of a campaign, Julian also had to deal with the fact that his troops were now questioning his sanity. And then, things got really bad. When Shapur's scouts reported back that the Romans were heading north up the Tigris, the king responded with a harsh but obvious strategy. Despite Roman fears to the contrary, Shapur was still not looking to initiate a set-piece battle, at least not yet, so he ordered his men to pour into the countryside and burn every single edible thing they could find. This scorched earth tactic was rough on his own people, but it was even rougher on the Romans. Julian had been expecting to be able to live off the land until they reached Armenia, or at least until they met Shapur in battle. But instead, the Sassanids were keeping their distance, offering no terms, and watching as the Romans starved. By the middle of June 363, the situation was desperate, and it was at this point that Julian met his fate. Once he determined that the Romans had been worn down by their grueling march north, Shapur finally ordered his army to begin harassing the legions. Skirmishes in the front and in the rear of the Roman line gave way to heavier fighting, and pretty soon the two sides were locked in a running battle. The Romans desperately attempted to push north, but could make almost no headway, and they were averaging just a few miles a day. But despite the bleakness of the situation, Julian never gave up. He never locked himself up in his tent, he never tried to run for it, and by all accounts, he never even hinted that he would do either of those things. He was constantly out in front of his men, leading them, fighting with them, encouraging them. There is absolutely no denying that he handled the situation as admirably as a man in his situation could. But there is also no denying that in the end, this admirable conduct is what killed him. The details of Julian's death are vague. Despite the fact that Ammianus Marcellinus was, we still don't know exactly what happened, which is understandable. We are talking about a clash between tens of thousands of men here. Unless he was right next to the emperor, even Marcellinus's account is going to be secondhand, and he wasn't right next to the emperor. That said, the standard account is that on June 26, 363 AD, the Sassanids hit the Romans with a multi-pronged assault. As Julian was trying to rally the men on one side, they were attacked from another. When he rushed over to rally the men on that side, they were attacked from a third side. In the midst of all this rushing around, Julian had neglected to don his breastplate. When word came of the attack, he had simply dashed off to lead his men. Admirable, but more than a little short-sighted. He was on his horse in the thick of the fray on that third front, when a spear came flying out of the Persian line and struck Julian in the side. Marcellinus says specifically that the spear grazed the emperor's arm and then lodged itself in his liver. Julian tried to remove the spear, but the blade was too long to get a firm grip, and he cut his hands in the process. Weak from shock and a loss of blood, the emperor fainted, then regained consciousness long enough to announce that his wound was not mortal, and then he fainted again. Julian was then rushed away from the scene, and his doctor immediately began to save the emperor's life. In his biography of Julian the Apostate, The Last Pagan, Adrian Murdoch spends a good amount of time at the end of the book trying to parse through the different versions of Julian's death to try and reach some tentative conclusion. Though Marcellinus is usually deferred to when it comes to Julian, Murdoch argues that the soldier historians believe that the emperor died on the same day he was wounded is suspect. First of all, the cause of Julian's death is described as strangulation, rather than something more directly related to the wound. This points to an infection, and infection is going to need time to build up. The reason this even matters is because as he lay dying, Julian, surprisingly, and not a little bit recklessly, never did name an heir. In Marcellinus's version, Julian spends his final evening engaged in some romantic deathbed philosophizing, but he never even hints at who ought to lead the army and the empire when he inevitably dies. This seems so ridiculously short-sighted that it calls the whole version of the story into question. If, however, Julian spent 3 days in bed slowed by a wound that did not necessarily look like it was killing him until, whoops, it killed him, then the fact that he did not name an heir makes sense. Put simply, the emperor did not believe he was dying, and so he did not name a successor. This is why I tend to believe that Julian died on June the 29th, 363 AD, 2 days after receiving the mortal wound. Either way, though, he was 31 years old and had ruled the empire for just a year and a half. Julian's short reign is unique in Roman history. Previous emperors had initiated fundamental changes to the way the empire operated, and previous emperors had of course served very short terms of office. but never had they done both at the same time. Julian had tried to pull off a system-wide overhaul of the empire that, had it succeeded, would have made his reign a key hinge point on the imperial timeline. Maybe his overhaul would not have been as grand as, say, Augustus's or Diocletian's had been, but it certainly might have had the power to diminish the prominent part Constantine plays in the history of the Western world. Perhaps it might have even served as a bookend to an anomalous Christian era for the empire. But the other emperors who dreamed big had the luck to serve a long time and see their reforms cemented into the bedrock of the system. Julian dreamed big, and then he died young. I honestly think that in terms of ambition of vision and brevity of rule, the only one who matches Julian is, and I know this is going to sound crazy, Elagabalus, who, like Julian, tried to reinvent Roman religion, but died before his reforms could firmly take root in the system. However, other than that superficial similarity, there is really nothing to connect the half-mad teenager Elagabalus to the genuinely conscientious Julian, so I really think that Julian the Apostate is a unique figure in Roman history, which makes him interesting, which means that we will never stop poring over his year and a half in office and wondering what might have been. All that said, however, in June of 363, the Roman army did not have the luxury of pondering what Julian's place in history was going to be. They were stranded in enemy territory, surrounded, and flailing. The emperor was dead, and no heir was in place. In other words, disaster loomed. Next week, Julian's officers will attempt to pick up the pieces and avert said disaster. But given the circumstances, and the fact that the legitimate imperial line was now suddenly extinct, well, in trying to solve the problem of what they were going to do next, they may have wound up simply swapping one disaster for another. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Capitulation. Last week, we left off with the Eastern legions in a bit of a scrape. The Emperor Julian was dead, he had not named a successor, and they were surrounded on all sides by a hostile Sassanid army. Any one of those things taken alone would have been pretty rotten, but taken together, well, let's break out the popcorn and see what happens next. After news of Julian's death got out, the senior officers of the army got together and tried to figure out what the hell they were going to do next. Naturally, the first order of business was figuring out who was in charge. After all, a good chain of command can't just peter out into a mud puddle of cavalry officers and supply chiefs. Someone's got to be the eye in the pyramid. With no imperial relatives around to make the choice easy on them, the officers turned to the most obvious non-royal candidate, the senior Praetorian prefect